The congregations that draw their roots back to St. Elizabeth Seton originally were 6 congregations, and we'll talk about those in a minute. But those 6 congregations were really not in communication with each other too much in the earlier, like between Elizabeth's death and, say, the early 1900s. There wasn't too much communication. They had gone their separate ways. There was some, but not a lot. It was only in the 1940s, and really in 1947, that these communities came together with the request that Elizabeth Seton become canonized. You know, there was enough history, enough reverence, enough stories about her, and evidence of graces and things that had been come to the sisters and people that they said, we really should work together. So when they presented the request for, at least to begin the process, which is a long one for canonization, the office that they approached in Rome said, well, you can only do this if you come to us as one, as one. We can't have 6 congregations asking for this. So that meant that the 6 congregations had to come together and to make this a common request. So the 6 congregations at the time were the Daughters of Charity in Emmitsburg, Maryland, and we'll tell you that story, how that was. Sisters of Charity of New York, Sisters of Charity of Halifax, Sisters of Charity of St. Elizabeth in Condon Station, New Jersey, Sisters of Charity of Seton Hill, Greensburg, Pennsylvania. So those are the original 6. So they came together in 1947, and they had their first meeting in Emmitsburg. They were invited there. Each community sent 2 sisters to begin this conversation on how would they make this request. So that was the beginning. And some of the requirements were, well, let's show how we are together. Like, what are you doing together? So one of the very first things that they did in the following year when they met in Halifax, so then they met here in Halifax, was that they chose the official picture of Elizabeth. Now you can imagine 6 congregations, 6 different pictures. They said, how are we going to do this? So I gave you a copy of what we say is the traditional picture of Elizabeth Seton that we all are very familiar with, all right? This originally is called the Felici portrait, because when she was in Italy after her husband died and she was recuperating and her daughter was recuperating and she was in that conversion process, she became very endeared to the family. They had her portrait painted. Now, if you see the original one, she's in a lovely blue satin dress, and she's got tufts of curls and a blue satin ribbon in her hair, but this is the profile. So when they were deciding on which picture, they said that was the best likeness of her, so they just painted her in the habit. So this is the official picture, but it originally called the Felici portrait. Okay, so the group of 6 congregational leaders kept meeting through those first years, and they were sharing stories on how favors had been granted and how it was important that not only they begin to, but that the communities, the sisters, begin to know more about Elizabeth Seton. Because if you talk to some of our own older sisters, they will tell you that in their early formation, they got the conferences of Vincent were read to them. They knew more about Vincent, very little about Elizabeth, and nothing about Louise Marillac, nothing at all. But it was only there in the late 40s, early 50s that they began to say, we've got to know more about her. And also, if you talk to some of those older sisters, they'll tell you that at that time, there was such an emphasis on Elizabeth that they were writing plays, and they had songs, and they wrote books, and you'll see a lot of early writings and children's coloring book. The New York Charities have a children's coloring book, which they still put out if you're interested in it. So they were really trying to promote more and more about Elizabeth. By 1963, the 6 congregations put together this common vocation book. Now, I don't know if any of you have seen it, but when I was 63, I got one. I think the sisters were trying to hook me at that point. you know, and in this, you'll see the 6 congregations are all represented in their original habit. Of course, that was their habit at the time, in the varied ministries that they were involved, whether it was for our sisters in Bermuda, or in the Bahamas, or in all the other places, in Harlem, New Jersey, wherever they were. And you can see the traditional habits in this. So this was the vocation booklet that became very popular. And as you can see, I still have it. I don't know if it's the original, but I still have it. It worked. It worked. But so that was another federation. So we had, the first thing was like, all right, we have a common card, a common picture, and we're putting this out as a common vocation thing to the Sisters of Charity, who drew their original roots from Elizabeth. By 1963, the steps for Elizabeth's beatification had come about. So in 1963, she was beatified, she had been venerated in 58, I think, and 63, and then the steps for the actual canonization were put in place. 1975, September 14th, St. Peter's Square, Pope Paul VI declared Elizabeth Seton the first American saint. And for any of us who were there, it was just a thrilling moment to hear your little lady up there and declared a saint for the whole church. But all right, so the federation was formed to have Elizabeth canonized. She's canonized. So now what? But there had been such a growth of spirit and just a wonderful collaboration, to use our today word, among the congregations. They said, we can't let this go. Let's keep it going, to have this as a common body among us. So they kept working on charism projects and different writings and different programs. In the 80s and 90s, they had developed what we call the shared vision, which the different congregations hosted in different places. And it was like a week-long program of workshops and talks and prayer experiences open to all the Federation sisters, and that went to a couple of different congregations. Halifax had sponsored one, and I went to one of those. By 1988, we had started the Charity Connections Group. That was another Federation project where there were representatives, one representative from each of the communities, who came together twice a year, and it was to write on the life and spirit of Elizabeth, but also Vincent, and we included Louise. And that Connections Committee lasted until, I think, 2 years ago, and that was their last. But in the time, I only have one hand, but these are the booklets of the writings. You may have seen these. They've just published the 3rd. But these are all the writings from that committee. And the membership changed on it, and the tenor of the writings, but they're wonderful insights into the life and spirit of our founding mothers and fathers, and also the founding mothers of the different congregations and different spirits. So that was another Federation project that has been very successful. 1992 was the first what we called Seton Legacy. Now that was a little different from the Shared Vision program. The Seton Legacy was a more scholarly approach to the life and spirit of Elizabeth and the charism. And some of our sisters from the different Federation groups who really were scholars in Elizabeth's life, but also theological background and strong presentations it was a scholarly symposia on her life. Phenomenal work, very good. Then they had a second one in 1966 and 1967, and one of those was also in Halifax. I remember going to that. After that, there was a group of sisters, Sister Judith Metz from Cincinnati, and Sister Regina Bechtel from New York, and Sister Betty McNeil from the Daughters of Charity in Emmitsburg, came together and started to do research on the writings of Elizabeth Seton. She was a prolific writer. She wrote, in a picture she had email. They said they collected over 3,000 pieces of writing from her. her journals, her letters, her book, I mean, everything. And there are published now 4 volumes of her writings, and each one is about this thick. And they're beautifully done. It's in a chronological way, but anything that she ever wrote, I'm sure there's a grocery list in there someplace, it's just, but wonderfully done. Now I understand that they're following up and they're going to begin collecting writings about her or to her. So I'm sure there'll be more than 4 volumes of that coming as well. So that's kind of just like a thumbnail of how the Federation began and why. Now, I think at this meeting we're going to hear that next June will be the first ever attempt at having a meeting of the Federation of the Whole. That means one meeting for everybody in the Federation who wants to come. Now, we're 3,000 strong. I mean, so you can imagine. I don't think they expect 3,000. But I think we'll hear more about that invitation, but that's next June, and that's been in the works for a long time. So there is a growing desire among the membership of the Federation. The Sisters and the Associates are a strong group in the Federation to come together and to get to know each other and to be that united body, in the spirit of Elizabeth. So you say this little 4'10" woman from New York City who did all this, did she know that all this was going to happen? Probably not. Probably not. I want to go over with you now our family tree. You know how everybody's doing genealogy? Well, we have one too. Okay. Now you're going to stay with me on this because like any family tree, it's like, well, this one got into this one, this one. So of course we start with Vincent de Paul and Louise de Marillac. I'm not going to give their life stories. You know their stories, and if you don't, I'll see you afterwards. But to know that they were back in the early 17th century in pre-French Revolutionary Paris, destitute, poor, coming from the countryside. It was just an awful social, economic, political situation. Vincent was a diocesan priest who saw the plight of the poor after his own conversion from being afraid of the poor to being endeared by the poor, saw their plight and felt helpless. He didn't know what to do. There was so much to do, so much to do. And he also knew that the clergy were not in the best shape, to put it bluntly. So in 1625, he founded what he called the Congregation of the Mission. These were priests that were dedicated to serving the poor and the needy in any way possible and to help educate and reform the clergy. So he used to have meetings. He called them the Tuesday clergy meetings, and he would bring the clergy together and he would teach them. He would teach them and bring them up to theological, because he was a canon lawyer and he was also theology. He would teach them the theology, the rubrics of the Mass. He did everything to help reform the clergy. And then his congregations was dedicated to serving in the missions. You'll hear his writings. He sends them off to Madagascar. Don't you love that way that sounds? Yeah, Madagascar, right? Or to India. He was sending them all over the world, So that was his vision, to help the poor and the needy, reform the clergy. In that helping the poor and the needy, he was overwhelmed by the amount of work that needed to be done, and he knew he couldn't do it alone. So he engaged the Ladies of Charity, who were really the first group of dedicated women in the church to help the poor and needy directly. And they celebrated their 400th anniversary about a year ago. So they're still an active, vibrant group. But he found, too, that they were not doing the work as he really wanted. They were ladies of nobility, and they would be sending their servants then to go to the houses of the poor. And it was like, Vincent was like, it's not exactly what I thought. So he was up creek, say. Louise de Marillac, who was one of his directees, because as a spiritual director, saw the need, and so she said that she would help him. She was a lady of the court also, but she had not a troubled background, but she was born illegitimately, which kept her from really being nobility, but she was recognized. So, and Louise had some scruples, and she was a little bit afraid of her own self and didn't trust her own gifts, but Vincent saw the potential in her, saw that she wanted to do something, give her life to something. So she at that point, she was a widow, and she had a young son, Michael. But she was willing to help him. So with Vincent's help, she began to train and to form the young peasant girls who were coming from the countryside to the city and willing to help, because the ladies of nobility had the desire, but they weren't really going to do the work. The poor were not afraid to serve the poor, and that's what she learned. But before she just sent them out, she trained them. She taught them to read. She wrote her own catechism for them so that they would know the faith, so that when they went out, it wasn't just helping the sick, but they were going to be bringers of the faith. That was so important to them at that time. So you can see the two of them made a dynamic duo. So this was the seed of this whole charism of charity. It began right there with Vincent and Louise. Very interesting, though, Vincent was reticent, and so was Louise, to call them sisters. We're not going to call them sisters because at the time, I'm not going to find the quote here, at the time, any woman who entered a religious community went into a cloister, because that was the model that was there. Well, that was going to defeat the purpose of helping the poor directly. That was not. So he said, no, we can't do it. And Louise said, no, they can't. They have to go out. So they didn't call them a congregation. They were called a company. So they were called a company of charity. And they had no religious rule over them that the church would have had for other communities. This is what they wrote, that having for a convent the houses of the sick, for a cell a hired room, for a chapel their parish church, for a cloister the streets of the city, for enclosure obedience, with an obligation to go nowhere but to the houses of the sick, for a grill the fear of God, for a veil holy modesty, making use of the continual confidence they have in divine providence, and offering all they are in their service to God in the person of the poor. So you can see that the charism was born as a direct service to the poor, to go into the homes, to be present physically and literally with the poor. So there was no cloister, there was no convent, there was no chapel, there was no structure. They came to Louise's house all the time for training, for rest, for refreshment, for education. She trained them and sent them back out. And she sent them out 2 by 2. She sent 2 nurses here, and she sent 4 teachers here. And she sent them, and she kept that all organized. Wonderful, wonderful woman. So that was the beginning. So they're the first ones. They're really way, way up there at the top. Vincent de Paul and Louise de Marillac. Then we go directly, of course, to our Elizabeth Bailey Seton, right under that. And we know her story, and we know that while she was in Italy, after her husband died, she became converted. She was converted to the Catholic faith through the devotion of the Felici family and the people with whom that she lived at the time. She was especially impressed by the life and work of Vincent de Paul and Louise de Marillac, because while she was there, she read about them. She read what they did, and she was so impressed. She was like, this is just, the rule was straightforward and direct. That's what she said. Like, if you're going to do it, you know, that kind of thing. She also felt very close to Louise because Louise was also a mother and a widow. She had just lost her husband. She had 5 children. The youngest was like a year old, and the oldest, Anna Maria, was 12 with her. You know, that span, and here she has, but Louise also was a mother and a widow, but she did this, so it was like she could do that with her life, you know. We know that after she went back to New York and her family disowned her because of her conversion, the Bishop Carroll invited her to come to Baltimore to open a school for girls, because he felt that if the girls and the women were educated, the faith would continue, because it's the mother who teaches the faith to the family. If they could read scripture, and they were educated, then the faith would continue, because this was the nation. It was like a seedling of the community of faith in Maryland. It was just beginning in a very Protestant country, so he wanted these roots to go down deep. So we know that Elizabeth went down. She did start the school. She was there for 2 years in the school, went there. And then he invited her in 1808 to think about beginning a religious community of American women to serve American church. There were other sisters from other countries already here, many of them cloistered. The Ursulines were in New Orleans and other places, but they were cloistered, So again, that's going to defeat, we need people who can get out and work with the poor, especially the settlers who were coming in and the immigrants. So in 1809, Elizabeth moved to Emmitsburg. She had the rule of Vincent and Louise, which she asked for. When Carol said to her, would you do this? She said, only if I can use the Vincent rule. So they sent to France, and Bishop Flaget came back from France with the rule. So that was what Elizabeth used. It was adapted to the American culture and to her situation as a mother with 5 kids. I mean, they had to write that into it. Also with the caveat that they would teach girls. So the original rule is that they would teach girls. Okay. So the mission of education was the primary thing. It's interesting, I'm just going to parallel this, that Vincent and Louise, they started the first apostolic congregation of women religious in the world. Before them, everybody was cloistered. They, with the Daughters of Charity, the Company of Charity, the first apostolic community of women came to be in the world. With Elizabeth, she began the first apostolic congregation of women in America. So we have 2 firsts in our family tree, but they're both from that same mission of charity. Okay, now we're going to go from Elizabeth. We're going to go, well, you'll see right below her, the Sisters of Charity of St. Joseph of Emmitsburg, Maryland. That's what she founded, 1809. And it's St. Joseph because that's the valley. That's the name of the valley. If you go to Emmitsburg, it's St. Joseph's Valley, okay? We'll get to that affiliation as we go through the story, okay? Just go up to the left-hand side of the page where we have Sisters of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul, New York. Okay. In 1817, Elizabeth sent sisters to New York at the request of the bishop to open a school and an orphanage. She was so happy because this was her native city. She said, I'll never get to go back, but my sisters will. So they went to St. Patrick's on Mott Street, and they opened an orphanage and a school, which only closed about 5 or 6 years ago. So it was in it. And in the time that, from 1817 until the 1840s, they grew to be about 65 sisters, right? Now, they still had the connection to Emmitsburg, so they had to be trained in Emmitsburg and come back, all right? But they could do that. Elizabeth Boyle, who was one of Elizabeth Seton's dearest friends in Emmitsburg, was her first counselor. Elizabeth was the superior and then first counselor. Best of friends. They said they even looked alike. There's a little story about when Elizabeth's sister went down to visit her, that when Elizabeth Boyle opened the door, she thought it was Elizabeth Seton. I mean, that's how much they resembled each other. But they were like 2 peas in a pie, Elizabeth Boyle and Elizabeth Seton. She sends Elizabeth Boyle to New York. She says, you can do this. So you open the New York, very successful. She opened another orphanage. They were serving hundreds of children. And they were able to change the rule for New York to take care of boys. They had an orphanage for boys. Now, that's different from the rule, but they were able to change it for that instance, okay, which is important in the story as we go down. So by 1846, now Elizabeth dies in 1821, as we know. By 1846, there was talk of uniting the Emmitsburg community with France. A couple of things were going on. That had happened a couple of times during Elizabeth's life, and she was adamant that that would not happen because Bishop Carroll wanted an American foundation for the American church. The French foundation would not be compatible to what they were trying to do. So Elizabeth didn't want it. Her cohorts knew she never wanted that. So in 1846, when it came again, there was a lot of conversation. It was like, this shouldn't happen, shouldn't happen. But what happened was that the Sulpician priests were the overriding superior of the community, which was the model at the time. You know, there was no women's community that was totally independent. There was always a male superior. So the Sulpician priests, who were a French foundation, were here in America and very good to Elizabeth and her community. But they were being recalled back to their original foundation, which was to train seminarians, not to take care of religious communities, of sisters. So they were being withdrawn from any place they were working with sisters. So in that interchange, the Sulpicians said, well, since you're following the rule of Vincent de Paul, the logical connection would be with the Vincentians. The Vincentian priest in France said, we would do it if they became a province of France. You see the connection here? All right. So if you was living in the White House in Emmitsburg and you got this news, it wouldn't be like, oh, how wonderful. Probably not. So anyway, it was a difficult time, a very difficult time. So the sisters in Emmitsburg, all the sisters in Emmitsburg and the sisters in New York, and we will talk about Cincinnati in a little bit, had to make the decision of whether they would remain in this congregation if they became daughters of charity. All right. Now, in New York, they were already 65 sisters doing this work with the orphanages. Archbishop Hughes loved the sisters, wanted them to stay. So you stay, you don't have to go back. You know, and he said, well, if you leave, I'm going to have to put the boys out on the street. Pull your heart out and step on it, right? Really. I mean, you're talking about these women who have raised these children, and now you're going to put them on the street if I go, you know, like, really. So anyway, they had to make their own decision. They couldn't talk to anybody about it. They couldn't, and in this community, it were blood sisters. So if you two were blood sisters, you lived together, you're working together, you couldn't talk to each other to say, I'm going to go and I'm going to stay. And they had to go into the chapel one by one. Mother Elizabeth Boyle's at the table and Archbishop Hughes, and they had to say, I'm going to stay or I'll return. Of the 65, 33 remained and 32 went back. It was their choice. It was their choice, whichever they wanted. So the 33 who remained, Archbishop Hughes promised them that if they stayed, that they could become an independent congregation in his diocese. So that was the birth of the Sisters of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul of New York. They were the first breakaway or the first fresh establishment from Mother Seton's very own settlement in Emmitsburg. Interesting, they chose the name Sisters of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul because they wanted to show their allegiance to the charism and mission of charity, that they were daughters of Vincent and Louise. Well, they didn't know Louise so much, but of Vincent as much as the Emmitsburg sisters would be. So the name is very significant. So they became an independent congregation in 1846. In 1847, Bishop Walsh from Halifax makes a little trip down to visit his friend, the Archbishop in New York, and is impressed with the sisters' work. Halifax is becoming its own city, you know, it's growing. It wasn't a diocese yet, but it was coming. He wanted sisters to come to Halifax, and the reputation of the New York sisters was wonderful. Goes to the sisters and says, could you send sisters to Halifax? They were 65, they're 33, doing the work of 65 and probably more. So in all honesty, she had to say to him, I don't have anybody to send you. But if you come back in 2 years, there were women were entering, I may have some I could send. Fine, 2 years. So he comes back. And in 1849, he comes back and he says the same thing. Of course, she still doesn't have people to spare, but the Archbishop prevailed, and lo and behold, she had 4 sisters that she could send to Halifax. So she sends Basilia McCann, who was it's interesting, Basilia McCann's history was that she was an Emmitsburg girl. So she's from Emmitsburg, and the legend is that Elizabeth Seton prepared her for her first communion. So she didn't become a sister under Elizabeth because Elizabeth would have died, but that Elizabeth prepared her for her first communion. She entered the sisters, she stayed with the New York sisters, and they said that she went all over. She was in St. Louis, she was up near Fordham. I mean, they used her because she was a great administrator. So she was chosen to come to Halifax with 3 other sisters. So they arrived here in 1849, and I think we know some of that story. You know, she came at St. Mary's on Barrington Street. They opened the orphanage. They opened the school. In 2 weeks' time, they came on May 24th, and in 2 weeks, they had 200 students and an orphan. You know, really. You know, like, sure. You know. So Basilia McCann then is our founding mother. What the caveat for any of these women, now this was a new development, you know, you write the story as you're living it, was that they had a 5-year window. Anyone who left from a community to open, to be a founding person, you had 5 years to go back to your original community if you wanted. You could stay with the new group, it was your thing. There was a lot of communication back and forth. We don't really know much about Basilia. We have no picture of her. She's the only founding mother we have no picture of, and we researched, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. We know that she was there and she built a community. She established us. They say she was very, very talented. There was a Sister Mary Conley who left a journal from her novitiate, and she was in the novitiate with Basilia, and she'd say, oh, she ran bazaars all the time to raise money. I said, that was a New York girl. There she was. Bazaars. But they said she was a wonderful educator, a good businesswoman, but she also was very handy. She built furniture. She built the tables for the novitiate, and so she was the woman to have by your side. By 1853, 54, there was conversation here in Halifax that there was going to be a real diocese and that they were going to become established. They also saw that any women from Halifax who were interested in entering the community had to go to New York for their novitiate because they were really Sisters of Charity of New York who were on mission. That distance in those days with traveling and very poor communication, it just didn't work. Very few, if any, stayed. So Basilia had the foresight to present to the council in New York to say, if there should be a future here, we need to establish a separate novitiate. Separate novitiate means separate mother house. So the council, the New York Council, decided that that was the thing to do. So by 1855, Halifax became an independent community from New York. Notice the name, Sisters of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul, Halifax. We copied exactly what the founding mothers in New York had done because we were faithful to the mission of Vincent in our charism and in our story. Basilia chose at that time, after we became independent, she chose to go back to New York. There's some communication there. There are records of where New York kept sending blankets and warm clothing and things, you know. I keep saying, you know, she started in Emmitsburg, which is the warm South. She lived in New York, and then she was up here in Halifax, you know, and this was before we had heating and all of this stuff. It could be that it was too much for her. Whatever the reason, we'll never know. But she went back to New York, and she she always was a Sister of Charity of New York. She never became a Sister of Charity of Halifax. And she's buried at their mother house, on their mother house grounds, right in front of Elizabeth Boyle. So that's where our story goes. So then I want to move over with you to the other side, Sisters of Charity of Cincinnati. Mother Margaret Cecilia George was also a very close friend of Elizabeth Seton. She was on the council with her, she was a confidant, and Margaret George knew Elizabeth's heart as well as Elizabeth Boyle did. So in this same time, see, she was sent after Elizabeth's death, went to Cincinnati, opened a foundation there as Sisters of Charity of New York, see? But in that interim between 29 and the 50s, this whole question of aligning yourself with France came. Margaret Cecilia decided that they would not go back to New York, to Emmitsburg. They didn't. None of those sisters went back. They became a separate congregation in 1852, and they are Sisters of Charity of Sisters of Charity of Cincinnati, with no connection to Vincent because she didn't want any connection with France at all. So you just see that, you know, like the political things that we deal with are not new, But they were making their statements, you know, and you have to admire. So, so they did not go back. Okay, now. So just under that, see where we had Elizabeth and the Emmitsburg, just that showing you the affiliation with the Daughters of Charity and the center happened in 1850. The superior came, she went over to France to do the affiliation, and then she came back in the French habit. So that's when the daughters came with the French habit and the French customs and all of the Daughters of Charity that joined them. And the sisters who went back there had to adapt all of that. They had to wear all of that. Okay. Now, the next one, I think, is one of the most interesting. You're going to need your two fingers to go from the Sisters of Charity of New York and Cincinnati and follow down to New Jersey, Sisters of Charity of St. Elizabeth. Okay. This is interesting. Bishop Bailey of New Jersey had just been named the first bishop of New Jersey. Bishop Bailey was Elizabeth Seton's nephew. So, of course, the diocese, schools, orphanages, who's he thinking of? He wants his aunt's community. So he goes to New York, and he says, can you send sisters to New Jersey because this is what I want to do, and I want your community because you really came from Elizabeth Seton. Well, of course, the dates, you know, they were talking about the 1850s. They still don't have a lot of people. So New York says, I really can't send anybody. So he says, okay. So he goes to Cincinnati, to Elizabeth's other friend. Can you send anybody? Well, Mother Margaret George didn't have sisters to send, but she said, if you send me the women that want to do this, I'll train them. So he got 5 women who were willing to be Sisters of Charity. I mean, it wasn't he had to coerce them. They had a vocation and they wanted to do this, to go to Cincinnati, where she and her sisters trained them to be Sisters of Charity. Okay, so now they come back. They're going to be professed. They're going to come back to New Jersey, but they're young. They're new. So he goes back to New York, and he says, okay, I've got the women. They're trained. Can you help me out by sending a superior to get them through the first years? So they look, and they chose Sister Mary Xavier Mahegan. Mary Xavier is her own interesting story. She's an Irish-born woman. She was a businesswoman in New Jersey. She came to New York on her own with her sister. Just one day they decided, they never told their mother and father they were leaving. It was like, we're going to work, never came home. In New York, there they are, set themselves up, met the Sisters of Charity, and really fell in love with them. So she became the first postulant of the New York Sisters of Charity. So you see all of these pieces coming together. But an astute businesswoman, she helped to build St. Vincent's Hospital. So she was one of the brainchild behind that. So with her business mind and her organization, and she was mature, she was a little older too, they asked her if she would go to New Jersey and help establish this new community. So she did. Went to New Jersey, and they became an independent congregation. Well, they were missioned in 1859. It's hard to see. It's 1860, but it's all around that same time. So during the time, they started in Jersey City. Then they moved out to the country, to Madison, and they started a college for women. All right, but how do you get from the city to the country in those days? You don't. Fortunately, the Erie-Lackawanna Railroad was going cross-country. It was just beginning. So it was going westward, and it was going right near them. So she said, she went down to the station or wherever, and she said to them, I need a station here because I'm going to open a college for women so the girls can come from the city. So he said, well, you can't have a station. He said, well, why can't I have a station? Well, because you don't have a road. He said, all I need is a road? All you need is a road. You get a road? No. So after school every day, she and her sisters went out and they built the road. So they built the road to the station, and that's why it's called Convent Station. And so she opened her college. I mean, there's nothing these women can't do, right? So anyway, she is their mother general. She stays as the founding mother. She stayed in office for 59 years, till her death. 59 years. She was revered. She was a saintly woman, but a really good businesswoman, you know, but 59 years, God bless her. Okay, so that's the Convent Station owes their foundation to the two congregations of Cincinnati and New York, so they come together. Okay, the last of the original ones is the Seton Hill. So we'll go back to the right side again under Cincinnati. All right. So the bishop, you know how bishops talk to each other. The bishop in Greensburg, this was after the Civil War, he wanted sisters to come because, again, they were opening a school and they needed the help, and the sisters had a good reputation. So the Sisters of Cincinnati sent 5 sisters to Greensburg to open the foundation and to do the mission as Sisters of Charity of Cincinnati, all right? But eventually, the bishop was asking for them to come and to stay. So Mother Aloysia Lowe, who was sent as the founding mother, they settled in Altoona, but she knew they needed a bigger space. This was not going to work. They needed to be, again, build a mother house, build a college, get, you know, as much educational opportunities out there. So she takes the bishop out to look at all of the possible places that they could build a mother house. And he was willing to, wherever you want, sister, we'll build it. So she takes him to this one place that she really likes. And look, no, sister, that's too big and it's much too expensive. I can't. All right, bishop. So they went to another place. No, well, I don't know about that. And then went to another place. She spent the whole day with him in the carriage, going from place to place to place. He was exhausted. So finally she said to him, she said, Bishop, I only have one more place I want to show you, and I promise whichever one you decide is the one that we'll take. So she takes him back to the first place. And she says, now this is a lovely piece of land, and we could develop, yes, sister, whatever you want, this is fine, this is exactly. So she got what she wanted. So they begin to build the college and the novitiate and all of that. And there's one more funny story with them. Now, again, these were astute businesswomen. You know, you're talking the 1850s, the 1860s. God bless them. So anyway, she goes down every day to examine what the builders are doing, and she sees the bricks have come, and she's like, these are not good bricks. Well, they'll be fine, Mother. They'll be fine. No, they're not. They're inferior. You are not going to use these bricks. No, they'll be fine. So she said no. She wasn't going to let them use the bricks. But, you know, men, women, who's going to win? So she sent up to the novitiate, and she asked all the novices to come down, and they sat on the bricks all day. So the men couldn't use them. So finally, he had to send the bricks back so they could continue building. So then she got the better bricks, and they built the mother house. So that's the last of the 6 original ones.
And was that the first American sit-in?
That could be the first American sit-in. That's true. That's true. So those are the first 6. Any questions or comments about them so far? You're okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. On that same side of the page, you're going to see a dotted line from Elizabeth Seton. It goes down the side. That Emmitsburg sent the rule. Now, the first 6 can actually draw their bloodline back to Elizabeth Seton, right back. You can see that story. These others used the rule of Elizabeth. So they didn't know her. They didn't have sisters come from those other houses. They just used the rule. So we have in 1812 Bishop Flagey, who was the bishop who brought the rule originally from France, and Bishop David, with whom Elizabeth worked, but there were little personality differences between them. He had worked with her in Emmitsburg, but it wasn't working. So she went to Bishop Carroll, and then he was transferred to Kentucky. So, so anyway, they were there, and they wanted to start the same kind of a foundation because they knew the success of the sisters, and it was doing what was needed, was helping the poor and the need for education. So they asked for Elizabeth, and in her lifetime, in 1812, she herself sent the rule to them. And Bishop David got 6 young women, Catherine Spaulding being the youngest of the 6, was named Mother. So they became the Sisters of Charity of Nazareth. Okay, so they're established by 1812, so they really are in Elizabeth's lifetime. Then, I'm going to skip the Providence one. I'll come back to that one. Okay. Then I'm going to go down to Sisters of Charity of Leavenworth. See how that arrow goes around? Okay. Mother Xavier Ross was a Sister of Charity of Nazareth. And in 1841, the bishop in Tennessee asked for sisters to come. So the pattern is, well, we'll send some sisters, let's see what happens. And so they went. Mother Xavier Ross went with 3 or 4 other sisters to Tennessee, and they became the Sisters of Charity of Tennessee. But by 1851, it was whatever happened, the bishop and the vicar in the diocese were not paying the bills for the sisters. I promise you the world, and I'm not giving you anything in the end. So they realized they didn't have anything. What were they going to pay back all of this with and everything? So, and then they said, well, we're not going to support you, a real turncoat on them. So they decided that they couldn't stay there. So what they did is they went to a bishop's meeting where there were many bishops, like we have the the USCCB, but it was the little group. But anyway, they went to the bishop's meeting, and they waited outside. They waited outside for all the bishops to come out, and they said to each bishop, do you want sisters in your diocese? Do you want sisters in your diocese? Would you want sisters in your diocese? So finally, the bishop from Leavenworth was very happy to have sisters in his diocese, so he took them to Leavenworth. So by 1858, there were no more Sisters of Charity of Tennessee because that went defunct. They became Sisters of Charity of Leavenworth, and it's a thriving community today. But they used the rule of Elizabeth. Again, no direct connection, but the rule. Okay? I better follow my notes here. Okay. The Sisters of Charity, we'll find them over here. Down, under here, under Convent Station. I'm just going to do this as chronology as best as I can. All right. Sisters of Charity of the Immaculate Conception in the middle, down the middle under the Convent Station, people. You'll see there's one line from New York that comes down. Okay. In 1854, Bishop John England, wanted sisters in his diocese also. This is in New Brunswick, St. John, New Brunswick, here in Canada. And this would have been the first English-speaking congregation in Canada, because we came just after that. See, they're 54, we were 55. So So anyway, he asks for sisters to come. The same kind of a story, goes to New York. New York doesn't have people to offer, but they send some novices, or he brings the women there who are trained in their novitiate. They come back, and they become the founding group for the Sisters of Charity of the Immaculate Conception. Mother Honora Conway is their founding mother, trained in New York, a New Brunswick woman, but trained in New York and came back. And there's an interesting anecdote about them later on. The Sisters of Charity of New York, who had visited there and, kind of spent some time with them recently, like within the last 20 years or so, it says it's amazing that their customs, their traditions, even some of their old prayer books were exactly like the New York sisters. They said that wish we had known who that novice director was in New York, there's multiplier, but how they're so strongly connected by spirit and mission and vision with the New York charities. So they are right here in New Brunswick, St. John, by Bay of Fundy and all that. That's where they are. Okay. So then we go, let's see, trying to keep this. Okay. So then we go back to Halifax, to our little box here. Okay. And then we have the Sisters of St. Martha from Antigonish. All right, we're talking about 1900 now. The Bishop of Antigonish had asked our sisters, the Halifax sisters, if they would establish an auxiliary community to staff St. Yves's or St. Francis Xavier College in Antigonish. No other congregation had an auxiliary community. It would be like domestics, to train sisters to be domestics, like education and healthcare and, all of those other things were our forte. But the bishop had asked. So the sisters, they did that. But anyway, the notion was there. So they trained 30 women from Antigonish in Halifax to be at St. Yves's University. When it came time for the sisters to go, 15 went back with the bishop, and the others didn't want to go, So when they came again to ask, because they were understaffed, then they asked, and there were 15 other sisters stood and went back with them. Anyway, they did it, but that whole notion of being domestics didn't last. Like that auxiliary community didn't happen. They named themselves Sisters of St. Martha, again with that idea of, being the servant sisters, but they had St. Francis Xavier College in Antigonish is one of the most famous, And when I was a young sister, everybody talked about St. Yves's, and I was like, what the heck is St. Yves's? Thinking Y-V-E, no, F-X, St. Francis Xavier, anyway. It's still a wonderful, and they're a wonderful congregation, and we have wonderful community with them now. So they are part of our federation. And in 1916, sisters went from Antigonish to Prince Edward Island to open a foundation there. And they became a separate congregation in 1916. And they are our newest federation members. They just joined the federation in 2017. So that they now are part of our federation as well. Okay. Another interesting, they're all interesting in my book, but another very interesting one, if we go back to, I'm going to come back to this one, okay, but go back to the Sisters of Charity in the middle column again, to the Immaculate Conception, then the last one there, the Notre Dame de Sacré-Cœur, see the French? Okay. Yes. Very interesting. They were part of the Immaculate Conception, the sisters in New Brunswick. New Brunswick, if you know Canada, I don't know it as well as some of you do, but there's a large Acadian population in New Brunswick, as well as the English-speaking. The SCICs, the Immaculate Conception Sisters, were really founded to work with the Irish immigrants who were coming into New Brunswick. But sidelong to that is this large Acadian population, French Canada, and they were not being served. A lot of the women had joined the congregation, but the Acadians were not being served in the same way. So a united group of them, the Acadian sisters, went to their superiors in the New Brunswick sisters and asked if they could form a separate French province to serve the Acadians and still be Sisters of Charity of the Immaculate Conception. The proposal went to Rome, and Rome denied it. I said that that was not going to be possible, but that didn't stop the sisters. So in 1924, they had 53 of their Acadian sisters left the Sisters of Charity of Immaculate Conception, and I'm going to cry, and became the Notre Dame de Sacré-Cœur, became a French-established Sisters of Charity. And the founding mother, Mother Maryann, was 72 years old when she did this. 72. So you're never too old to do anything. And when I visited there, maybe in like 2001 or 2002, the last of that founding group was still living. Yeah, so we had a chance to meet her. She was about 98 or something, but she was the last of that group that left in that historical movement. So that's the skeleton here, okay. I have another box sign. Oh, I'm not going to let that one go. On this corner, the Vincentian Sisters of Charity, they are Slovakian in foundation, so that they really were not an American-based, but they followed the rule of Vincent. They were requested by the Bishop of Pittsburgh to come and to work with the Slovakian community who had come to be coal miners for the most part and to work the coals and, on all of the fields. So they came as a mission in 1902 to work with them. Now, one little catch is that in Slovakia, they were Sisters of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul. They come here, and we already have in Greensburg Sisters of Charity, well, of Seton Hill, but they were Sisters of Charity. So it's Sisters of Charity here. Then the New York Sisters, there were too many. So the bishop asked them if they would change their name. So they became the Vincentian Sisters of Charity. So that's the change of their name. But they really are Slovakian born, but they are of the same rule. They use the rule of Vincent de Paul. They became an independent community here in 1915. They had a province in Bedford, Ohio, of the same sisters, went to another place to work with different people. But again, because of transportation and different geographical reasons, they became a separate congregation in 1939. What happened with them was they were small in number. And this happened recently, like within the last 20 years, yes, that they became, the sisters in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, aligned themselves with the Sisters of Charity of Nazareth. They felt a comfort zone with them, and they shared similar ideas. And anyway, they eventually became Sisters of Charity of Nazareth. So that meant that they had to make new vows as Sisters of Charity of Nazareth so that that Vincentian Sisters of Pittsburgh no longer exists as a congregation. The Vincentian Sisters in Bedford, Ohio, aligned themselves with the Sisters of Charity of Cincinnati because they're very close geographically, and they became Sisters of Charity of Cincinnati. So they still are part of the Federation, but under the new community. So both groups dissolved to their original foundations and became, under new vows, Sisters of Charity of Cincinnati and of Nazareth. Okay. The one group I left out for you, it was the Canadian group under the Nazareth. It's on the right. Sisters of Charity of Providence. I don't really know a lot about them, except that they do follow the rule of Vincent de Paul. They have the Vincentian spirit, mission. They do everything that's Vincentian if you were to be with them. The only thing is that the Sisters of Providence have a large federation, and they belong to that. So by federation, they really belong to the Providence Federation. But by spirit, mission, and rule, they really are Vincentians at heart. So they do have a little place on our map, but they really are not in the Federation. So that's the story of our federation. Any questions, comments, little stories? Any other little stories? Okay. Yeah.
These women were amazing.
Yes, yes, in that day and age, right? Yeah.
Did you mention the one from South Carolina?
Oh, South Carolina. I'm sorry.
That's okay. I
didn't
was
do
just
that.
wondering.
I didn't. Of Charleston, yes. That was Bishop John England. Yes, he requested the rule of Elizabeth. He had 4 women from Baltimore that wanted to serve in his diocese and be sisters. So he got the rule from Elizabeth, from Emmitsburg, from her time. And then they just founded their own Sisters of Charity of Our Lady of Mercy. Right now, they're a very tiny congregation. I think they're under 20 in number, but they're part of our federation, and they belong to many community committees, and they're a vital member. And at some point, they may have a conversation about covenanting with one of the other federation branches. Yeah. So, any other questions or comments about anything?
Looking through the Federation, and I really love the Federation, I look at it as being an outreach of our cousins all over. And we've had we've been fortunate to have met the Sisters of Charity of Cincinnati, who came from the Bedford province because of our relationship project for our manual, and they've been very hospitable and willing to share their first story and how they really amalgamate. It's really wonderful that these are women of so great faith, that they're not young women, most of them, that they would take this step, to begin almost anew.
That's right.
It's
That's
phenomenal.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
Sharon, did you like this?
I just wondered if all of these various sisters, charity, all over the place, are they still, you mentioned a couple now that are still operational, yes.
Every one of these congregations, they're all operational.
They're all,
this is our whole federation. There are 13 congregations in
13?
the federation.
Okay.
Yes, they're all present there. I mean, these 2 now are amalgamated into the others, but they're all there. And you'll see we can look at the chart if that makes it any clear and more helpful. But every one of those congregations has, their own governance structure, and they all belong to the Federation and take part in the projects. Yes, yeah, they're all there. Different numbers, as we heard today, I don't like to use the word diminishment. I say we're in transition. We're in the chrysalis, of something else. But the mission of charity, what I love is that each group committed to the mission and the vision of Vincent and Louise, that it's direct service to the poor, no cloister, no fanciness. We look like and we're with everybody else, like there was no distinction about who we were and who we are among any of this, and that today, I mean, what drives us? What was today? It's the focus on the mission which keeps us going. Yeah. Just quickly to just go over this, the Sisters of Charity Federation has become disorganized within the last 10 years. It wasn't, it was always a wonderful organization, but the presidency and the organization wasn't structured like this. Well, because I think there was more and more interest growing in activities and participation, and as you can see, all the different groups that have grown. It used to be that I think it was every year, they met in a different mother house, and the leadership would get together, and they still do. And the way you decided who was in charge, it was like, who was the president of the last place, who's the president of this place, and who's the president of the next place. Those 3 superiors were the presidency. So you can see how fluid that was. Every year it changed, So for those of us who were in some of these little groups, like the Formation Group, which has a long history in the Federation, we would send reports and it'd be like, well, who does the report go to this year? there wasn't a strong structural organization because the need wasn't there. But once they began to see that the members were becoming more involved, there were more opportunities for involvement, activities, programs, you have to change the container so that it's more meaningful. So this happened within the last 10 or 12 years. That, of course, the members are all of us, right? Then there's the board of directors, which really is the congregational leader, president, or superior of all of those congregations. So every single one of them has a representative as a board of directors. The executive committee, of course, is a smaller group that meets regularly, and the executive director is an independent person who her term overruns anyone's, and we've had a couple at this point. Sister Grace Herzog from the Seton Hill is now that director. You can see some of the things they do. Seton Heritage Ministries, which is the new name for the museum and all the activities in Emmitsburg. They have their own independent finance committee. A connection to the Vincentian family organizations, which are multiple, which is another chart for another day, okay? And you can see all the other committees, the NGO, the planning committee, grassroots involvement, which is the group that plans those retreats. They had one in New Jersey, they're having one in Leavenworth. Then under that is our New York, New Jersey grassroots Federation Connections, where we meet. And we do an activity every year for the congregations in New York, New Jersey. The House of Charity, about which you've heard, I'm sure, in New Orleans, where people go to volunteer and they can live there as a house of hospitality. The communicators. The CCFP is a company of charity formation personnel. That's all the people who do formation, and the associates are part of that group. The archivist, and then the Seton writings that I mentioned before, the 4 volumes and then the new volumes. So this is the present Federation structure, okay? So thank you all for your attention.
Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure.
Thank you, Maryann. You did a wonderful job.
Thank you.
Oh,
Good,
it's always
great.
interesting to hear all those stories, you know? Yeah.
Good,
Thanks.
very good, okay.